for putting the shutter back in the body. Now the first thing we've got to do here is place our dished washers in position. Now these are vaguely dish shaped. That's so that when you apply the tension to them they crush down, so there's some adjustment there. And you set them up so that if the bottom washers here are dish shaped hollow at the top, then the washers above them go the opposite way up, so they are domed at the top. And if you think this is a bit fiddly, it is a bit fiddly. And it gets worse. I've got my 4 screws ready to go to hold the front panel in place. And in an ideal world I'd have 2 longer screws that I can put in place. I don't think I need them for this one. I don't think I'll need them. Right, so here's our front section. Making sure that the shutter is not cocked. Making sure that the baffle is pushed back into the camera. Now remember this pin coming out of the front of the camera. That's your rangefinder pin. It's useful to push it in from the back of the camera with one finger lightly and hold your finger against it at the front, effectively holding it forward so that it's forward in position. What we have to do now is get the front of the camera in position, back in place. We have to hook it under the chrome top piece here. And we have to get this gear, this little gear here, this little pinion, to fall neatly into the position here. As you can imagine, it's not always straightforward, but it can be done. I know it can be done because I frequently do it. Okay, so it starts. I'm going to lower this into position at the top of the camera. Hook it in under that chrome trim. And I felt that that pinion dropped into place. I've got 4 screws. One of them will be much prettier than the others because it never had glue on it. I've only started at a couple of turns, no more than a couple of turns. The pretty one that's never had glue on it came from this position here. And yes, it is awkward getting that down in place, and you've got to get it through those dished washers. Now that front's not settled in place, I can tell that. I've just gave it a bit of a wriggle and it dropped down into place. And I can get these screws started at the bottom. I just need to start them, I don't need to tighten them up. I can wriggle that front into place. Everything's connected. I'll check my rangefinder connection. The rangefinder pin here pushes the arm here back, so I'm checking that that's coupled correctly. The collar on the rangefinder pin couples to this arm here, and you'll see if I move it that arm moves. That shifts the frames. So the front's back on the camera. Now there's probably 1 chance in 3 that I've got this correct, maybe 50% chance. So what do I need to do? Well, I'm just going to press the release to release the film, hold down the film lock pin with my finger, run the film advance, and the shutter didn't cock. I can feel it didn't move far enough. So basically it tells me that I'm one tooth out between the transfer shaft here and the gear in the front of the camera. What are my options? If it was the other way, I know I could cheat. I could loosen the screws holding this clamp plate down and then lift this tab up to allow it to rotate, to fall back over it if it was trying to cock too far, if the action of the film advance couldn't complete because the shutter had reached the stop of its action. We haven't got that problem. So what I'll have to do is go through the procedure again and hopefully get my shutter on the front of the camera, get that gear moved as far as it will go, because there's always a certain amount of play there, as far as it will go, so that it moves as soon as the transfer shaft shifts it. So back out again. Of course, when we take the front of the camera off, the washers will fall back into the body in a traditional fashion and cause us to say bother and blow. Now, can I lift this screw out? Yeah, just. Alright. So I lift this up from the base. And see if I can wriggle it out from the body at the top. Yeah, it's not keen. Check the position of my washers, and miracle of miracles, they're still where I left them. That's good. There's no play in this shaft here, so there's no way I can twist it left or right in order to advance or retard it relative to the front section. So I'm checking this position of this gear. You can probably see here that there's a little bit of play. So I need to rotate this wheel, looking at it this way, I need to rotate it anti-clockwise as far as it will go to take up that slack. That's all I want to do, is take up the slack. I don't want to move it any further than that. Weird things happen. If you get this too far advanced, weird things happen. Like you'll discover that the self-timer won't run, things of that nature. Right, try again. Just drop that down into place. Start the screws. And you have to start all 4 screws, because if you don't, as soon as you disturb the camera, the washers in this corner will have taken the opportunity to go AWOL. On this camera there were 2 washers at each of those positions. On later cameras there are 3 washers at each position. Which means the stack of washers is a bit more precarious, and it becomes even more fun to try and fit the front without disturbing anything. Okay, let's try again. Same deal, hold my finger down on the lock button, press the shutter release, hold my finger, why is that not happening? Okay, press, something's not happening. There, hold down the lock button. Alright. Now the film release there didn't release, which might mean that the adjustment's incorrect. Let me just, yeah, that's exactly it. So what's happening is that my shutter release here is not pressing the film release down far enough in order to release it. And the shutter release won't go down any further than its own limit of travel will allow it to do so. So it means I have to get a screwdriver down in here, a small screwdriver, and back off the adjustment screw on the top of the film release. So I'll do that next. You have to take care at this stage not to dislodge the meter, because if you dislodge the meter, you have to take the front off the camera to put all the cord back correctly, which is very tedious. Alright, let's try again. Cock the shutter, and it didn't. I was able to release fire the shutter, but I didn't release the film release, so I'll wind that up another turn. Cock the shutter. Still the same. I've obviously wound that down much too far. There we go. Now I'm listening to see if I can hear the film release set before the shutter fires. That was the click, that was the film release releasing before the shutter fired. I'm pressing very gently and slowly on the top of the shutter release. That was it, that was the click releasing the film advance. And it took a bit more travel before the shutter fired. That's probably too big a gap, and I will just adjust that screw down a quarter of a turn and try again. That was the film releasing, that was the shutter firing. So I want to bring the screw back, take it down another quarter of a turn. Film releasing, shutter firing. I'm still releasing the film too early. I couldn't distinguish a difference there. Now that time the shutter's fired, but the film did not release. So I've gone too far. I'll give that about a quarter of a turn. No, need to come back up. That's okay. The film release is releasing just slightly before the shutter fires on the downward stroke. That's okay. That's a suitable way to have that organised. If the film release is released much earlier than the time in the position of the stroke of the shutter release before the shutter fires, what can happen is if you're busy lining up a shot and you're getting ready to take it and you squeeze gently on the shutter release, you might get past the stage where you've released the film advance, but if you stop at that point for any reason, if the subject changes or somebody's moved or something and you take your finger back off the shutter button, what you've done is you've released the film advance to allow it to wind on to the next frame, and you'll end up with a blank. Now that's more acceptable than the alternative. The alternative is if the shutter fires first. If the shutter fires first, if you squeeze very gently on the shutter release button, you can release the shutter. If you don't continue with the travel of that button, you may stop at that point. if you take your finger off the shutter release button, you'll find that the film advances locks. You can't wind on. Then you would press your film release, have to press the film release button to wind on. That's a nuisance. That's a nuisance, and these days when film is comparatively cheap, you can do without that nuisance. It's better that the film releases slightly before the shutter fires rather than the other way, if there's a choice. In an ideal world, those actions happen at exactly the same time. But we don't live in an ideal world. Right, so the front of the camera's on. I can do up these screws. Now, there is a distance to set this up. In an ideal world, you would use a dial gauge, and you would read on the front of this focus, this lens mount here, and you would take a measurement from there to the film plane at the back. And that's how I set them up. I've got a plate that sits on. I can set them up. In fact, usually how I do it is I have a jig set up, so there's a plate built into it, a post that comes up, and it's set to the distance I require it to be from the film plane. And then I can move my dial gauge from the centre post to various points on the mount and check that they're correct. Because we've got the dished washers in there, the spring washers, it means that this can be set at over a reasonable range of distance back into the body. Now, what is usually more than adequate is to set this up, do the screws up, until this plate here, the front of this plate here, is level with the front of the casting. You can tell as you slide a screwdriver across it which one's high and which one's low. When you run your screwdriver across it and you can't feel any difference there, you know that you've got this front face level with the body at that side. This side's not quite so convenient because you can't get at it at this point, but you can here. One thing I've never tested was whether the later cameras that always had 3 washers in each position also had the recess in the body milled down slightly deeper to allow a greater range in both directions for making the adjustment. I've never tested that, I just don't know. There's no literature around to tell me that. Perhaps one day I'll get out there with my measuring gear and find out. Right, that appears to be good. So at this stage, the shutter's all back in the body, the meter's in place. Next, really, we can put the front rings back on the shutter, then put the rangefinder in position, adjust the rangefinder, close up the camera top, and put the chrome trim back on the camera bottom. At the moment I've got that short one. Now the reason I used that short one probably became obvious when I was installing this front piece. It's to allow me to get this front in place, otherwise the chrome trim would be wrapped around that point and it would be a nuisance. There are alternatives. I mean, you could have left that off completely, but then what tends to happen is when you press down on the film release, that the shaft comes out, the hook spring gets hooked behind it. It's a bother and a nuisance. You don't want it. The alternative would be to fit the base plate, but only have the screws right at this end, leave this end flapping, in which case you could pull it back with your finger slightly while you're dropping this front piece in. Either way, it's more awkward. I do it this way because it's convenient and because I had a damaged base from an old camera that I could cut away to allow me to keep my advanced mechanism in a very handy and useful fashion while exposing this front gap in the body so I could lower the front piece in. So, front control rings next, I think. So here are the front control rings. Now these ones I've had apart and cleaned, so I don't need to do anything more to them. But basically we've got 4 pieces here. Let me zoom out a little bit. Here's your front section. Here we have the aperture settings. Here we have the shutter speed settings. And here we have the coupler that goes in the middle. And that effectively, that's got a little gear on it. And it means that those dials counter-rotate. When one moves in one direction, the other one moves in the other direction. So, first task is to take our aperture ring. We have to hook it onto the end of this spring. There's a little hook in here. And all of these parts should have been got as clean as possible. Now stretching that spring out slightly, I can line up this tab with the slot. It's retained there in that position. You can feel that the spring will pop it back into position. That's nice and smooth. Just checking that everything's sitting nicely, that spring is popped down in place. That's all good. I'll zoom you back in. This part's important. This brass ring here, there's a cutout in the brass ring here. Now, this has to be aligned correctly here. There's a slot in the aluminium mount at this point. That cutout should be lined up with the edge of that slot, just like that. Our shutter speed dial goes on the camera. Now, the shutter speed dial rotates, click stops, all the speeds. When it gets to the B position, it unhooks from here and revolves around further. That's controlled by this groove here and this spring tab here. So I'll put a bit of molybdenum paste down there. It doesn't need much. We've got to make sure that that spring tab is sitting in position in that little notch. That's just like that. This should show B. The shutter speed is set to B. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Something I haven't told you. Let's back up a couple of notches. Before we go crazy, I need to find something. As things stand at the moment, we have no coupling between the front of the camera and the meter. That's achieved by this little pinion here. Now that's got flats on this end. It goes into the slot in the front of that drum, of the cable drum at the bottom. I'm putting a bit of molybdenum paste on this. This is sometimes very awkward to get into position. So I've lowered it down. I think it's aligned with the slot, but I'm not sure. I'm just going to move it slightly with the tip of my tweezers, tip of a screwdriver, see if I can get it to drop into position. There it did, it dropped in. So it's engaged, it's correctly engaged. That's what we needed to achieve. Now this little idler pinion, just lubricating the centre of that slightly, that drops onto that shaft and engages with that other pinion there. Just for good measure, I'm just going to put a tiny spot of molybdenum on the tooth of that gear. Now back where we were, to get this in place. That should pop there, and that little tab on the shutter is a little bit enthusiastic and doesn't want to go behind there. Alright, so that's sitting in place. The shutter speed is at B. Our meter was where we left it, which is because we didn't take pains not to disturb the drum. This is where we've just set it up with that slot aligned correctly. Now holding this in one hand, I need to lower this into position, lining up the screw holes on the front. There's 3 screw holes. And holding this back with my thumbs to the body, I'm checking that that is all back in place. It's all level. That's all good. So at this stage, everything is coupled. And I can run these screws in. I find the right screwdriver. I'll put that screw in. I didn't do it right up hard. I've just run it up to the top of the end of its travel, and the same for its mates. Don't do it up tight yet. We have to check that everything works. And if something is misaligned and you pull the screws up tight, you could end up damaging something. Alright, so that's all in place. Now I want to check the action of the front rings. The plastic tabs here of course are connected to the shutter speed ring, so I'm checking that that moves. It does. I'm checking the settings wheel at the base of the camera to see if I can move the aperture setting and of course the meter setting at the same time, and I can. So let's set it to 125th of a second. If I roll the wheel with my thumb, you can see I can move all the way through the aperture range. So I'm going to check the entire range now at 500th of a second. Can we move things? We can move from 2.8, well you can move beyond that to the unmarked position, all the way through to f22. So f22 at 500 would be the minimum exposure you could give with this camera anyway. So if we move our shutter speed dial the other way, you'll notice that as I turn this past the limit, it also starts moving the meter. Here I am set at 250 seconds. Of course that's not actually timed, you'd have to do that yourself. So I'm right at the limit of how far the shutter speed dial will rotate. And can we get our apertures, all our apertures in at the B setting there? Let's see. So we can go f2.8 right through to 22 there. And you can get at B, you can go beyond f2.8. That would be the f1.9 position if this camera had been so marked. I know later cameras were all marked. Why some of the early cameras were only marked to f2.8, I don't really know. It may be that the camera was initially launched with only the f2.8 lens. So that's all correctly set. The next thing I would probably want to do is check the accuracy of the meter, and I will go and do that against a calibrated light source. But I'll go and do that. I'll report back. I'm not going to show you how I go through all of that.